Is climate change mostly science, or is it political or economic? How does it affect you? Is the Texas drought one result of global climate change? The debate continues regarding global climate change, but is it an intellectually honest debate? What can we observe regarding the impact climate change has had on humans, butterflies, birds, coral reefs, glaciers, and the polar caps? Global warming is a hot topic. Over 99% of documented species are now extinct. We are part of the remaining 1%. Today on Access News, we'll talk with Professor Camille Parmesan, whose early research on the migration of Edith's checkerspot butterflies made clear that global climate change has significant life-altering implications. Professor Parmesan was a lead author for the third assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC, which won a Nobel Peace Prize jointly with Al Gore in 2007. I'm Tamara, and you're watching Access News, hands-on news. Access News is pleased to welcome Dr. Camille Parmesan, who shares a Nobel Peace Prize with the authors of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change from the University of Texas at Austin. Dr. Parmesan is a biologist who has worked extensively researching the effects of global warming and weather changes on biological systems. Professor, welcome to Access News.
Thank you.
As you know, Austin has been so hot recently. It's been in the triple digits for a while. And, you know, we think this is the worst drought in Texas history. Is that a sign of climate change?
It may be, but a lot of people confuse weather with climate. And whether it's what's happening on a very short term, so it's the heat wave or the drought, climate is the average of what's happening over decades. And so Texas weather is very variable, and therefore it's difficult to say whether this single summer is an effect of general global warming, but it may be. And it's whether if this keeps happening over and over the next decade or the next 20 years, then I would say yes, we're seeing a sign of climate change affecting Texas weather.
I really am glad that you brought that up, because I didn't know the difference between weather and climate. So that's interesting. Obviously, there's a lot more about the weather and climate that we need to learn about so that we understand those differences. Now, from that, what is important? Why is it important for you to talk about the weather? And what's important for us to know about the weather?
Well, I think you're right. Most people are confused about the difference between weather and climate. And it's important to talk about the weather because the impact of gradual climate change is changes in immediate weather. And so those two things are connected. But when you talk about the effects of climate change, it's the frequency of certain events increasing. So the severity of hurricanes has increased and will likely continue to increase. The frequency of heat waves and droughts is increasing in the southwestern USA, and where that Austin just falls on the edge of that region, that's showing increases in drought and severity of heat waves. So we are seeing that these extreme events are increasing around the world, and Texas may be starting to feel that.
I'm definitely feeling it. and want to talk a little bit more about your research. I understand that you won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2007, co-authored with the IPCC. Could you tell us a little bit about the report and what was it like for you writing that report?
Well, so a lot of us shared in the Nobel Peace Prize. I want to make that clear. It wasn't just me. It was about 1,200 people. And it wasn't for a single report. It was really for the whole process of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which has been going on since the early 1990s. And that process was designed to bring together the state-of-the-art of the science of climate change and its impacts in a way that policymakers could understand it. So to synthesize all the science, there's this huge book that has all the gritty detail, but then it gets narrowed down to just a 20-page document called the Summary for Policymakers, because everyone knows policymakers aren't going to read a 1,500-page report. So the idea was really it's useful for scientists because it does bring all the science together in one place, but it was really meant to be particularly useful to policymakers so that they, as they were coming up with their ideas for how to combat climate change, they would have the very best science available to them.
That's understandable. Okay, so what's your experience when you put together that report? I understand you tracked butterflies for 4.5 years?
Well, that was my own research study. So that was part of the report, but it was one of hundreds of studies that we put together to make up a summary statement for how wildlife was being impacted by climate change. So it was an interesting process. It was scientists, but it was scientists from many different disciplines. So I had to learn something about economics. I had to learn a lot about climate science. And so it was fascinating, and it was wonderful. As someone who loves to learn, it was wonderful for me to be able to be part of a process where I was learning so much, as well as helping to present the best science in my field in a way that's accessible to people who can really make a difference.
I can imagine that was really fascinating. I learned a little bit about your research beforehand, and my first thought was, why butterflies? What can we learn about butterflies? And so I'm sure some of our viewers are thinking the same thing. So I'm wondering, why did you choose butterflies, and specifically the Edith checkerspot butterflies?
Well, I'm going to be honest that I chose Edith's checkerspot partly because it lives in really beautiful, cool places up in the mountains and in northern U.S. and Canada. But I didn't choose it to work on climate change. I was working on basic ecology, evolution, and behavior. So I did 10 years of very basic research when, in about 1992, climate change was starting to get some press, and there was a call for fellowships by the mission to Planet Earth that NASA funded. And I thought, well, they're wanting to fund work on climate change. And here I've been working on this butterfly that we know is very, very sensitive to climate. So years of research going back to the 1950s showed that this butterfly, the populations went extinct in extreme climate years, extreme drought, extreme heavy snow. And so I thought that this would be a good, what we call indicator species of climate change if it were happening. Because at the time, it wasn't even clear that it was happening. So I applied for this fellowship. I got it. I got 3 years of funding, and that's when I ended up spending, it ended up being 4.5 years, traveling from Mexico to Canada, from the West Coast all the way to Colorado, looking at these populations, looking at sites that had been recorded up to 150 years ago, and asking whether the butterflies were still present. And by doing that, I was able to show that a lot of populations had gone extinct, but it wasn't random. They were going extinct much more in the southern part of the range in Mexico, and they were hardly going extinct at all up in Canada and the high mountains, so that the whole range had shifted. And this was a very important finding because at that point, when this paper was published, the climate scientists were only just starting to realize that we were really seeing a significant warming trend. So those two papers, actually mine and Tom Carl's and colleagues, came out in the same year. So it was like two indicators of climate change, completely independent, coming out in the same year.
Thank you so much for sharing such interesting information. Now, you know Access News tries to educate our viewers about founding documents. So we actually have another host. His name is Don Miller, and he's going to explain a little bit about our founding documents. So we're going to take a few minutes and watch, okay?
Excellent.
Thanks, Tamara. Hi, I'm Don Miller. I think I can say that most of us do not like war. Not all colonists wanted to go to war with Great Britain. The American Revolution was no exception. Yet eventually, we did. We celebrate our independence from Great Britain every July 4th. But how did we go about declaring our independence? What were some of the considerations that were deliberated prior to our declaration? How did we make it known that we wanted to be our own country separate from Great Britain? Let's watch.
Today, it is celebrated with great fanfare every July 4th. It is Independence Day for over 300 million Americans. However, unlike most revolutions, America's Independence Day celebrates not a bloody battle or the overthrow of a malevolent dictator or monarch. The American Independence Day celebrates an intellectual document, the Declaration of Independence. This document was the defining moment of American political thought and philosophy that American colonists had been striving toward since the French and Indian War. By the spring of 1776, opposition to American independence centered in the middle colonies of Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, and Maryland. By the time the Continental Congress met in Philadelphia State House that June, the only question concerning independence left before the representatives was the timing. Should they wait for a groundswell from the people? Thomas Jefferson argued that Congress should act immediately. The people wait for us to lead the way. The representatives agreed that Congress should wait 3 weeks, while delegates from the mid-Atlantic colonies shored up support for independence. Meanwhile, Congress appointed a committee led by Thomas Jefferson to write the document. By July 1st, they had a document that began with soaring phrases now taught to every American student. When, in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitled them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. On July 1st, the committee presented the document to Congress. Representatives debated it for 4 days. Little was changed except that a long passage which blamed Negro slavery on the king was eliminated. On July 4th, the Declaration of Independence passed with no negative votes recorded against it. The 13 colonies unanimously declared themselves independent of Great Britain. The celebration began as it was read to a throng of people outside of the State House. Great celebrations of joy followed throughout the colonies, but the war had still to be won.
That war, the American Revolutionary War, was fought between 1775 and 1783. Many unjust events were endured by the colonists, including the Stamp Act of 1765, taxation without representation, the Boston Tea Party, and Shays' Rebellion. Any chance of avoiding war ended when the colonies declared independence in July 1776 and formed a new nation, the United States of America. We continue to celebrate our independence from Great Britain every July 4th. Someone once said, "War is a failure of diplomacy." Do you agree? Share your opinions with us. Join the discussion at our website, accessnews.us. .us for United States. What do you think? For Access News, I'm Don Miller.
Thank you, Don. Now we're back with Professor Camille Parmesan talking about butterflies and the weather. Dr. Parmesan, often we see the word climate change and global warming. People use them interchangeably. Is there a difference?
They really are the same thing. The scientists prefer climate change because global warming implies it's only temperature, which it isn't. It's a lot of other things. It's hurricanes and droughts and heavy snow events. And also it implies that every single dot on the earth is warming. And there are a few places that are cooling, and that's all part of climate change as well. Most of the world is warming, though. So global warming, climate change, you can use either one.
Thank you for clarifying that. Now, when people see the word climate change, I think they tend to think that it's only an environmental issue, but really it's a political issue as well. So I'm wondering, when we vote for our politicians, as the elections come up, how do we decide which politicians to vote for?
Well, one thing is there are a lot of places where you can get the science on what's happening with climate change and the impacts. You don't have to listen to the politicians. I would advise you not to listen to the politicians. They have an agenda.
That's the best advice, yeah.
Yeah, but Union of Concerned Scientists has an excellent website and web portal for learning about climate change and its impacts. And I can give you other lists if you want to put it up on your website. And these are all good, solid science websites. And there is the IPCC Summary for Policymakers, which anyone is able to read. I mean, it was designed so that all you need is, a little bit of a university education, and you should be able to understand it. You don't need any scientific background. So I would advise people to go there and look at the facts and then decide which politicians they want to vote for.
So should we choose politicians that are in favor of reducing carbon footprints or improving, emissions and those kinds of policies?
Oh, absolutely. So the science of climate change is very solid. We know that the emission of greenhouse gases, including carbon dioxide, is causing the climate to generally warm up. It's causing major changes in ocean circulation. It's causing changes in atmospheric circulation. And it is starting to cause increases in these extreme weather events like heat waves and droughts and intense hurricanes. So we know this is all happening. The data is very, very clear. It's been supported. It's been replicated by many, many independent groups. Therefore, if we know all that, and we know we're starting to see some pretty severe impacts on not just wildlife, but on human systems as well, like tropical diseases coming up into Texas, for example. So if we know it's happening and we can start seeing its impacts now, then I think we do need to do something about it. It's very clear to me. And the only way we're going to do something about it is by an international agreement to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And we've had international agreements before. When we had the ozone hole, there was a huge international agreement to reduce chlorofluorocarbons. And it was very successful, and the ozone hole is starting to recover. So we know we can do this. And what we need is the will and agreement amongst all the nations. Therefore, we need to vote in politicians who are willing to be part of that process. And so far, the U.S. has really said, well, the rest of the world can do this, but we're going to opt out. We're going to do it on our own, and we haven't really done much. So you've got Europe, who is committed to the Kyoto Protocol, which isn't perfect, but it is at least an attempt to cap greenhouse gas emissions. Several European countries have succeeded in meeting that cap, and the U.S. is still debating whether it's happening. So we've got to get politicians.
Why is that? Why is the U.S. so resistant to the concept of climate change? It seems that there's a lot of scientific evidence, there's a lot of research showing it. Why are people still so resistant to that concept?
I think there are two things going on. One is, for whatever reason, in the U.S. it's become a political debate. It isn't a political debate in most other countries. In England, both the right and the left wing agree that climate change is happening, something has to be done about it. They might disagree on what exact methods to use to reduce climate change, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but they agree on the process. And in the US, it's become a political debate, which is like, why is a rigorous science suddenly becoming politicized? So I don't really know the answer to that, but I think part of it is that we're further south than a lot of Europe. As you go further north, the impacts of climate change get more severe. So a lot of the US, the lower US, in many places, people aren't feeling the impacts of climate change in their backyard. So,
yeah, the U.S. can be a very reactive country.
Yes.
And they can take action, tend to take action when they see it with their own eyes. So
yes.
Maybe we just need to, let them know that we're going to become extinct or something that extreme. I don't know. Are we facing extinction?
Well, I wouldn't be that extreme yet, but we're certainly facing some pretty severe economic impacts. With rise of sea level, for instance, a lot of our cities are right on the coast, and sea level has risen by quite a bit, almost a foot at this point. So we're going to start seeing, every time we get a severe storm, and those are increasing too, we're going to start seeing much bigger damage along the coastal system. So, Rita and Katrina back to back did have an impact for a few months, maybe a year, and then suddenly people forgot about that.
Many times I've seen the phrase, think globally and act locally. We see that all the time. What's your experience, and what can we do to act locally?
Well, the thinking globally is voting, because that has to be done at the global level amongst the politicians. But there's a lot that people can do locally. Supporting green energy programs like Austin Energy has, where you might pay a little bit more, but you're supporting renewable energies. Put solar panels on your house. Buy a smaller, more fuel-efficient car. I just bought a Prius. I love it. And it's so quiet. It stops the motor and you just cruise around town. It's fantastic. Supporting some recycling, like aluminum plastics, is very, very good for the environment. And changing getting the community to support the city being carbon neutral, for example, so that city buildings have lower carbon emissions. The universities are starting a program to lower their carbon emissions. University of Texas, I believe, has signed on to it. So there's a lot you can do, both as an individual, changing your own behaviors, keeping your air conditioning set to a slightly warmer temperature, in the summertime, cooler temperature in the wintertime. But there's things you can do to support processes in your community that will lower the carbon emissions of your city and support renewable energies.
That's great advice. Thank you. I really appreciate your time and sharing your experiences and research here with us today. Thank you for being with us on Access News.
Thank you, and I should say I really appreciate your doing this kind of show, because, as I've mentioned before, it's incredibly important for the people to get the science, I think, directly from the scientists, not listen necessarily to the politicians.
Thank you. You can learn more about Dr. Parmesan's work at the UT website at biosci.utexas.edu and at our website, accessnews.us. You can ask questions, join the discussion, share your opinions. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter. One beautiful thing about America is that we, the people, have power. The more we know, the better decisions we can make. For Access News, I'm Tamara, and that's Austin.
Executive producers Devorah Ben-Moshe, Ken Hurley. With funding from the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation through the Knight Community Information Challenge. Supported by the Austin Community Foundation, fostering philanthropy in Austin for 35 years. The Austin Community Foundation, for now and forever. Created and written by Devorah Ben-Moshe, Ken Hurley. Hosted by Tamara Suiter-Ocuto. Interpreter for Tamara Suiter-Ocuto, Jennifer Stoker. Segment host for A More Perfect Union, Don Miller. Voicing for Don Miller, Ken Hurley. Crew. Producer Linda Latowski, Director-Editor Orlando Lopez, 3D Animation Doug Gray, Technical Director Carla Sadenia, Director of Photography Brian Blake, Assistant to the Producer Susan Harper, Original Music Aaron Jake, Camera Doug Gray, Tim O'Neill, Ross Wilsey, Production Sound Mixer Rod Simonson, Teleprompter Operator Brandon Taj Mora. Additional crew, photographers Eve Granick, Devore Ben-Moshe, intern Brandon Taj Mora. Additional interpreters Jacob Stacy, Tracy Hughley, Jessica Graves. Website developed by Electric Leaf, Jonathan Braden. Closed captioning provided by CPC, Closed Captioning and Subtitle Services. Civic Education video segments provided by Ambrose Video Publishing. Special thanks to Susan Mernant, Lisa Williams, Mary Ben Ramsey, Monica Williams, Janice Kelklar, Paula Lang, Jeff Garvey. Claire Bugan, Bobby Guerrera, Russell Harvard, Cynthia Foss, Bill Stotesbury, Caitlin Mack, Yitzhak Ben-Moshe, Bobby Nord, Kenneth Gladish.
Hi, I'm Tamara, host of Access News. Join me as I talk with renowned scientists, community advocates, powerful business leaders, and politicians from both sides of the aisle. Professor Camille Parmesan, a Nobel Prize winner and concerned scientist, discusses climate change and how you can make a difference. Join me each Sunday at 1 p.m. on KLRU Austin for Access News, hands-on news.